The hiss of steam was a dying breath against the Wyoming wind. It was a wind that had no respect for boundaries, a relentless force that scoured the plains and tore at the very soul of the land. Maeve Collier felt it through the wool of her coat, a chill so profound it seemed to settle in her bones. She stood on the raw timber platform of Sagebrush Crossing, the sole passenger to disembark, and watched the train pull away, its rhythmic clatter fading into the vast, indifferent silence. The engine's smoke was snatched by the wind and shredded against a sky the color of old pewter. Her hand, stiff with cold inside its thin glove, tightened on the handle of her leather valise. The case held everything she owned: a change of clothes, her sewing kit, a worn book of poetry, and the heavy weight of a past she had traveled 2,000 miles to escape. On her back, she wore the promise that was meant to be her future. It was a wedding dress, once a proud creation of cream-colored serge, its careful stitches a testament to months of hopeful labor. Now, the hem was travel-stained, the fabric creased and tired. The dress was a costume for a play whose leading man had failed to appear. She scanned the dusty street. There was no one waiting. No tall man with kind eyes and a steady hand as described in the letters. No Jasper Quinn. A hollow space opened in her chest, a void the wind rushed to fill. For a moment, she was nothing more than a statue of disappointment, a woman in a wedding dress stranded at the end of the world. The town itself was a handful of wooden buildings huddled together as if for warmth against the immense emptiness of the high plains. A gust of wind sent a tumbleweed skittering down the main thoroughfare, the only thing that moved with any energy. Pride was a luxury she could not afford, but shame was a persistent companion. She pulled her coat tighter, a futile gesture against the eyes she felt on her, real or imagined. A mail-order bride, unclaimed at the station. It was a story as old and sad as the wind itself. A single beacon of warmth beckoned from across the street. Steam fogged the large front window of a building with a simple painted sign, Hattie Bell's Eatery. Good food, fair price. The promise of heat was a siren song. Maeve straightened her spine, lifted the valise that suddenly felt heavier than a coffin, and crossed the frozen ruts of the road. The moment she pushed open the door, she was enveloped. The air inside was thick with the scent of roasted coffee, beef stew, and wood smoke from the cast-iron stove that roared in the corner. It was a sanctuary of scent and sound. A low murmur of conversation hummed beneath the clatter of forks on stoneware. A dozen faces turned to look at her. A dozen pairs of eyes taking in the worn wedding dress and the out-of-place valise. The talk did not stop, but it lowered, became more measured, a current of curiosity running beneath the surface. Behind the long counter stood a woman who could only be Hattie Bell. She was built like the land itself, solid and unyielding, with graying hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She wiped the counter with a damp cloth, her movements economical and precise. "Wind'll be the death of us all," Hattie said, her voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to come from the floorboards. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. "You look like you've wrestled it and lost. Sit, coffee's hot." Maeve found a small table near the window, setting her valise beside her like a silent chaperone. She was grateful to be out of the wind, to feel the warmth seeping back into her fingers and toes. The coffee Hattie brought was black, strong, and scalding. Maeve wrapped her hands around the thick ceramic mug, letting its heat penetrate her skin. From this vantage point, she listened. The conversations around her were the town's pulse. Two cattlemen at the counter spoke in low tones. Drought last summer took half the herd. Now Pryor's got a stranglehold on the Sweetwater. Charges a man a king's ransom for a trickle. His companion nodded grimly. Heard he bought up the deeds to the whole North Bank after the spring flood, the one that took Hart's wife. A man can't get ahead when the water itself is owned by another. The name Silas Pryor was spoken with a mixture of fear and resentment. He was a shadow over their words, a man who controlled the lifeblood of the territory. The mention of a flood, of a man named Hart, losing his wife, added another layer of sorrow to the landscape. This was a place shaped by hardship, where survival was a daily negotiation with the elements and the ambitions of powerful men. Maeve nursed her coffee, making it last. Each minute she sat here, the reality of her situation settled more heavily. She had enough money for a room for a few nights, perhaps a week if she was frugal. After that, nothing. The promise of a new life, of a home and a name, had vanished like a puff of train smoke in the Wyoming wind. She was alone, with a useless wedding dress and a secret she prayed would remain buried. Just as a knot of despair began to tighten in her stomach, a wagon rumbled past the window, the iron-shod wheels crunching on the frozen ground. It was a simple, sturdy farm wagon, pulled by two stout horses. A man sat at the reins, his posture straight, his gaze fixed ahead. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat and a hat pulled low against the wind, its brim casting his face in shadow. Even from a distance, Maeve could sense a stillness about him, a quiet containment that seemed to defy the blustering world around him. Beside him on the bench sat a small child, a girl wrapped in so many layers of wool she looked like a round, bundled doll. Only her face was visible, framed by a red woolen cap. Her eyes, wide and dark, were fixed on Maeve. As the wagon passed, the little girl did not look away. She stared through the window with an unnerving intensity, a profound and solemn curiosity that made Maeve feel seen in a way that was both unsettling and strangely comforting. The wagon passed from view. The moment was gone. Maeve let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. She had to move, to do something. Sitting here, an object of pity and speculation, was not a solution. She paid Hattie for the coffee, the coins cold in her palm. "You got a place to stay?" Hattie asked, her gaze direct, not unkind. "I was to be met," Maeve answered, the words tasting like ash. "I will find the sheriff's office. Perhaps he has a message." Hattie gave a short, non-committal grunt. "Sheriff's a good man. Deputy Rowe is better. Watch your step out there. Ice is starting to slick over." The advice was timely. The temperature had dropped as the afternoon sun weakened, and the damp ground had frozen into treacherous sheets of ice. Maeve stepped out of the eatery, the wind hitting her with renewed force. It howled in her ears, a lonely, mournful sound. She took a careful step, then another, her attention on the valise and the slick, uneven ground. She did not see the wagon, which had stopped a little way down the street in front of the mercantile. She did not see the man climbing down, nor the little girl being lifted to the ground. She only knew that her boot heel found a patch of black ice, and suddenly the world tilted. Her feet slid out from under her. The valise flew from her grasp, and she went down, bracing for the hard, unforgiving impact of the frozen earth. It never came. A hand, strong and calloused, clamped around her upper arm, arresting her fall with a jolt that rattled her teeth. Another arm wrapped securely around her waist, pulling her upright against a body that was as solid as an oak tree. For a second, she was pressed against the rough sheepskin of a coat that smelled of hay, cold air, and something else, something clean and faintly of wood smoke. She looked up into the face of the man from the wagon. He was not handsome in the way of city men. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with fine lines etched at the corners of his eyes. His jaw was firm, his mouth a straight, unsmiling line, but his eyes, a deep, steady brown, held a quiet intelligence. They looked at her not with pity, but with a kind of weary assessment. "Seems the ground's in a hurry to meet you," he said. His voice was a low baritone, as dry as the dusty land. Maeve felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks, a mix of embarrassment and gratitude. "Thank you. I was not paying attention." He released her, stepping back to give her space, though he stayed close enough to catch her again if needed. His gaze was distant, guarded. He was a man who had built walls around himself, and she had just stumbled right into one of them. The little girl, who had been standing by the wagon wheel, now came closer, She looked from Maeve's face to her father's, then back again. She took a small sniff of the air. "Papa," she whispered, her voice high and clear, tugging on the sleeve of his coat. "She smells like Mama's soap, the one with the flowers." The man's expression did not change, but Maeve saw something flicker in the depths of his eyes. A shadow of pain, swift and sharp. He placed a hand on his daughter's head, a gentle, protective gesture. The walls around him seemed to grow a little higher, a little thicker. He looked at Maeve, then at the sky, where the gray clouds were growing darker, heavier. The first few flakes of snow began to drift down, swirling in the relentless wind. "Night's coming on fast," he said, his tone flat, matter of fact. "There is a storm behind it. The boarding house is likely full with folks waiting out the weather. It is no place for a lady alone." He paused, and for a moment Maeve thought that was all he would say. He seemed to be wrestling with himself, with a reluctance so strong it was almost a physical presence. "My ranch is a few miles out. Heart's Draw. You are welcome to take shelter there until the storm passes. It is warm, and it is safe." Maeve's mind reeled. The cattleman's conversation came back to her. Hart, the man who lost his wife in the flood. This was him. This was the widower. Cole Hart. And this must be his daughter, June. The offer was a lifeline, a moment of unexpected grace in a day defined by its absence. But to go with a stranger, a man she had just met, to his isolated home, her entire being screamed with caution. She had trusted one man's words on paper and found herself abandoned. How could she trust this silent, grieving man's actions? "You are very kind, Mr. Hart," she said, her voice unsteady, "but I could not impose." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shrug. "It is not an imposition. It is common sense. This is not Virginia. Madam, out here, a storm can kill you as quick as a bullet. The choice is yours." He did not press her. He simply stated the facts of their world. He turned as if to lift his daughter back into the wagon, leaving the decision entirely in her hands. Maeve looked down the darkening street. The lights in the windows of Sagebrush Crossing seemed small and fragile against the encroaching night. The snow was falling faster now, the wind whipping it into a stinging curtain. Hattie's words echoed in her ears. "Watch your step." The cold was a physical thing, a predator stalking the edges of the town. She looked at Cole Hart's broad, capable back, and at the small girl, June, who was watching her with those same solemn, knowing eyes. The choice was not a choice at all. It was survival. "I accept," Maeve said, the words carried away by the wind almost as soon as she spoke them. "Thank you. Mr. Hart, I accept." He turned back, his expression unreadable. He simply nodded, then picked up her valise as if it weighed nothing. He helped her onto the wagon seat, the wood cold and hard beneath her, before lifting his daughter up to sit between them. He took the reins, and with a soft click of his tongue, set the horses in motion. They moved past the last lights of the town and into the vast, gathering dark of the Wyoming territory. The wind howled its lonely song, and the snow fell, blanketing the world in a silent, unforgiving white. The Hart Ranch house was not large, but it was built to withstand the Wyoming wind. Its walls were thick logs, chinked with mud and straw, and the roof was pitched steep to shed the snow. Inside, a fire crackled in a large stone hearth, casting a flickering, golden light across a main room that served as kitchen, dining area, and living space. The air smelled of pine smoke, leather, and a faint, lingering dust. It was a man's home, clean but spare, missing the small touches that speak of a woman's presence. A neat stack of mended harnesses sat on a bench, but a fraying cuff on Cole's own shirt had gone unnoticed. Maeve felt the weight of her intrusion with every breath. She was a stranger in this quiet, masculine space, a guest by necessity and not by invitation. Cole had shown her to a small room off the main living area, likely his own, as it contained a large, unadorned bed and a simple wooden chest. He had taken a bedroll for himself to sleep by the fire, closer to June's small cot. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his words few and far between. He was not inhospitable, but a wall of reserve surrounded him, as vast and impenetrable as the winter landscape outside. The following morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world buried in a pristine blanket of white. The silence was absolute. Maeve could not bear to be an idle burden. After a breakfast of coffee and hard biscuits eaten in near silence, she found her voice. "Mr. Hart," she began, her hands folded in her lap. "I have skills. I am a seamstress. I can cook. I will not be a charity case in your home." Cole looked up from cleaning a rifle part, his hands pausing in their work. His expression was unreadable. "You are a guest, madam, caught in a storm." "The storm is over," she countered gently. "But my situation is not. Please, let me earn my keep, at least for a few days, until I can make other arrangements." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze taking in her determined chin and the earnestness in her eyes. Perhaps he saw something other than a damsel in distress. Perhaps he saw a fellow survivor. He gave a single, curt nod. "The larder is there. June's coat has a tear in the sleeve." It was all the permission she needed. Maeve felt a surge of purpose, a small but vital anchor in the sea of her uncertainty. She found potatoes, onions, and a small piece of salted beef in the larder. Soon, the savory aroma of a slow, simmering stew began to fill the house, a warm, comforting scent that subtly changed the character of the room. While it cooked, she took June's small red coat and, with thread from her own valise, mended the torn sleeve with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. June, who had been watching her with quiet fascination, finally sidled closer. She held up a small wooden bird with a broken wing. "Can you fix him too?" she asked, her voice a hopeful whisper. Maeve smiled, the first genuine smile to touch her lips in days. "I can certainly try." She found a sliver of wood and some strong thread, and soon the bird was mended, its wing stiff but whole. June cradled it in her hands, her face alight with a joy so pure it made Maeve's heart ache. The little girl began to chatter, telling Maeve about the bird, about her pony, about the secret places she played in the barn. As Maeve listened and responded, she felt a layer of her own frozen apprehension begin to thaw. From across the room, Cole watched them. He did not speak or move, but his hands had stilled their work. He saw the easy way Maeve spoke to his daughter, the gentle patience in her eyes. He saw June, who had been so quiet since her mother's death, blossom under the woman's attention. When June let out a peal of laughter at something Maeve said, Cole's gaze softened, the hard lines around his mouth relaxing for a fraction of a second before tightening once more. It was a sound he had not heard nearly enough in the past year, and it struck a chord deep within him, a note of both profound longing and sharp, defensive fear. As evening descended, the wind began to rise again, whistling through the cracks in the log walls. The sound was a mournful counterpoint to the crackling fire. It was then that Maeve heard another sound, a faint, metallic clinking from outside the front door. "What is that noise?" she asked. Cole looked toward the door. "The water bell?" He offered no further explanation. A water bell. He seemed to decide the question was harmless enough. "After the flood last spring, I hung it. There is a float down at the draw. If the water rises too fast, it pulls a line, rings the bell. A warning." The words were simple, practical, but they carried the immense weight of his loss. A bell to warn against the very thing that had taken his wife. It was a symbol of his vigilance, a constant, tangible reminder of the day the earth and water had betrayed him. The sound was not a comfort, but a sentry, guarding a wound that had never healed. The next day, Cole announced he had to ride into town for supplies. He hesitated, then looked at Maeve. "You can come, if you have a mind to, or you can stay here with June." The thought of facing the curious eyes of Sagebrush Crossing again made her stomach clench, but the idea of being left alone, even with the sweet-natured June, felt worse. "I will come," she said. The town was slowly digging itself out from the snow. Cole left Maeve and June in the wagon while he went into the mercantile. After a few minutes, a man wearing a deputy's star on his coat approached. He was young, with a serious face and honest eyes. "Cole," he said, his voice low. "Good to see you made it through the storm." "Abel," Cole acknowledged with a nod. Deputy Abel Rowe glanced toward Maeve, his curiosity evident but polite. He lowered his voice further. "I need a word. Silas Pryor was at the land office yesterday. He is filing claims on all the unrecorded water access points along the Sweetwater. Says the county survey was wrong. He is trying to lock everyone out." Cole's jaw tightened. "He cannot do that. My deed is clear." Abel shook his head, his expression troubled. "That is the thing. Pryor's man says there is a smudge on the record for your lower pasture, the one by the draw. Makes the boundary unclear. Silas is pushing the commission to reevaluate, and in the meantime, he is raising the water fees for everyone downstream, threatening to foreclose on folks who cannot pay." The news settled like a stone in the cold air. It was not just a business dispute. It was an attack on his family's land, his very livelihood. It was one more battle in a life that already felt full of them. "I will handle Pryor," Cole said, his voice flat and hard. "Just be careful," Abel warned. "He has got men working for him that are not interested in a fair fight." As the deputy walked away, Cole's silence seemed to deepen, to become something colder and harder. He finished his business and drove the wagon to Hattie Bell's. The eatery was warm and bustling. Hattie looked them over as they sat at a table, her sharp eyes moving from Cole's grim face to Maeve's quiet posture. "Well, look what the storm blew in," she said, her tone dry as dust. "And here I thought you were planning on becoming a permanent hermit. Hart, good to see you remembered other people exist." She set 2 mugs of coffee on the table and brought a guest. "The town's been buzzing." The unclaimed bride. Maeve flushed, but Hattie's gaze was not malicious. It was simply direct. She needed shelter from the storm. "Hattie," Cole said, his voice a low warning. "I am sure she did," Hattie replied, unfazed. "Everyone needs shelter from one storm or another." She looked at Maeve. "This one is a stubborn fool, but his heart is in the right place. Even if he keeps it locked up tighter than Pryor's bank vault, do not let his silence scare you off." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. The threat from Silas Pryor hung in the air between them. Maeve now understood that Cole was not just fighting his own grief. He was fighting for his home, for his daughter's future. That evening, as June was getting ready for bed, Maeve made a decision. She could not drift. She could not be a bystander in this house. She needed to plant her feet, however, temporarily. She found a piece of paper and a pencil stub and wrote out a simple agreement. It stated that in exchange for room and board, she, Maeve Collier, would perform the duties of a housekeeper and seamstress for Cole Hart, for a term of 1 month, renewable upon agreement. It was a business arrangement, a way to define her place and maintain her dignity. She presented it to him after June was asleep. He read the neatly written lines, his brow furrowed. He looked from the paper to her face. "This is not necessary," he said. "For me, it is," she insisted. "I will not be an object of charity. Mr. Hart, I am a worker. Please, it is a way for me to repay your kindness." He saw the iron resolve in her eyes. It was the same resolve he possessed. He took the pencil and, at the bottom of the page, signed his name in a strong, clear hand, Cole Hart. He pushed the paper back toward her. Their fingers brushed as she took it. A brief, fleeting contact that sent a surprising jolt of warmth through her. Later that night, as the wind howled its lonely song outside, Maeve sat by June's cot, softly singing a nursery rhyme her own mother had taught her. It was a simple tune about a star, a silly little song, But June's eyes had grown heavy, and a small smile graced her sleeping face. Cole stood in the shadows of the doorway, just outside the circle of lamplight. He had been on his way to check the horses, but had stopped when he heard the singing. He watched the gentle way Maeve smoothed the blanket over his daughter. He saw the firelight catch the soft strands of her hair. The scene was one of peace, of domestic tranquility, a warmth that had been absent from his home for so long he had forgotten what it felt like. He wanted to step into that light, to be a part of it, but the memory of what he had lost held him back, a ghost standing guard at the threshold. He stood there for a long time, a man caught between a past he could not escape and a future he was terrified to embrace, listening to a stranger's song fill the empty spaces of his house. A kind of quiet rhythm established itself at heart's draw. It was a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of a 4-year-old child. Days began before dawn with the scraping of the coffee grinder and ended with the banking of the fire against the long, cold night. Maeve found her place within this rhythm not as a guest, but as a functioning part of the household. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended. She brought an order to the small house that went beyond mere tidiness, and in doing so, she carved out a space for herself, a small territory of purpose in a world that had tried to leave her with none. But the world outside the draw did not forget her. In a place as small and isolated as Sagebrush Crossing, a story like hers was a valuable commodity. The unclaimed mail-order bride, now living under the roof of the town's most solitary widower. The whispers followed her like her own shadow whenever she had to go to the mercantile for flour or thread. She felt the stares of the women, a mixture of pity and suspicion. She saw the speculative glances of the men. It was a heavy cloak to wear, this unearned reputation. Hattie Bell, in her usual blunt fashion, gave voice to the gossip one afternoon when Maeve was in the eatery. "They are saying you have set your cap for him," Hattie said, slamming a plate of cornbread on the counter. "Saying you played the part of the helpless woman to get your foot in his door. Fools, they do not know the first thing about helplessness, or about a good man's grief. I am working for my keep, Hattie," Maeve said, her voice low and steady, though a blush crept up her neck. "We have a signed agreement." Hattie snorted. A piece of paper will not stop tongues from wagging. This town is starved for a story. Just be sure you are the one writing it. It was on that same trip to town that a new door opened. A young woman with bright, intelligent eyes and a determined set to her chin approached Maeve outside the post office. "You must be Miss Collier," the woman said, extending a gloved hand. "I am Maggie O'Rourke. I am the schoolteacher." Maeve shook her hand, surprised by the direct and friendly gesture. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Miss O'Rourke. I have heard you are an accomplished seamstress," Maggie went on, her smile warm. "But I have also heard that you read. Is that true?" "Yes, I read," Maeve confirmed. "Then you know what a gift it is. Many of the children on the outlying ranches have no schooling at all. Their parents are too busy or cannot read themselves. I have been thinking, I want to start a reading circle for them, perhaps one afternoon a week. Hattie has offered a corner of the eatery. I cannot do it alone. I was wondering if you might be willing to help." The offer was like a sudden ray of sunshine in a gray sky. It was a chance to be seen as something other than the abandoned bride or the widower's housekeeper. It was a chance to be useful, to be part of the community on her own terms. "I would like that very much, Miss O'Rourke," Maeve said, a genuine warmth spreading through her chest. The work on the ranch was constant and demanding. A section of fence on the north pasture had been weakened by the heavy snows. Cole rode out to fix it, and Maeve, leaving June to play with her wooden dolls by the fire, insisted on coming along to help. She was surprisingly adept, holding the posts steady while Cole drove them into the hard ground, handing him staples and stretching the cold wire with a pair of pliers. They worked in a comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the rhythmic pounding of the hammer and the sigh of the wind through the pines. During a break, Cole poured coffee from a metal flask into 2 tin cups. Maeve took a sip and tried not to grimace. It was black, bitter, and tasted faintly of smoke and metal. "My apologies if my coffee does not meet Virginia standards," Cole said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips for the first time. "It is not the state of Virginia that would find fault with this." "Mr. Hart," Maeve retorted, her own lips twitching. "It is the entire institution of coffee itself. I believe the beans may have personally offended you in some way." He actually chuckled, a low, rusty sound, as if the mechanism were long out of use. "It keeps a man warm." "So does a fire," she said, "and you do not have to drink it." The easy moment of humor lingered between them, a small spark in the vast, cold landscape. They finished the fence, their movements falling into an unspoken partnership. That afternoon, a newborn calf, weak and shivering, was struggling in the cold. Together, they carried it into the barn, rubbing it down with dry sacks and making a warm bed of straw for it near its mother. In these shared, simple acts of labor and care, the wall of Cole's reserve seemed to develop small, almost imperceptible cracks. The peace of their quiet routine was shattered one night. A sharp, grating sound from outside woke Maeve from a light sleep. It was the squeal of the hand pump near the well house, a sound that had no business being made in the dead of night. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. A moment later, she heard the floorboards in the main room creak as Cole moved. She slipped out of her room and saw him by the front door, pulling on his boots, a rifle in his hand. "Stay inside and lock this door behind me," he whispered, his voice hard. "Do not open it for anyone but me." He was gone before she could reply. Melting into the moonless dark, Maeve rushed to the window, peering out into the blackness. She could see nothing but the faint outline of the barn against the star-dusted sky. She heard the sound of running feet, a muffled curse, and then silence. The minutes stretched into an eternity. She stood frozen, her fear a cold knot in her stomach. Finally, the door rattled. "Maeve, it is me." Her hands trembled as she fumbled with the bolt. Cole stepped inside, bringing a gust of frigid air with him. His face was grim in the low lamplight. "He got away," he said, his breathing heavy. "He was trying to jam the pump mechanism." Headed east, toward the river. "Did you see who it was?" "No, too dark, but he dropped this." He opened his hand. In his palm lay a small, dark object. It was a metal rivet, but it was not a standard one. It had a distinctive, almost star-shaped head. "I have seen these before," Cole said, his voice low and dangerous. "The freight wagon Silas Pryor uses to haul his equipment have custom ironwork. They use these rivets." The implication was clear. This was not a random act of vandalism. It was a message, an attack on his water supply, the lifeblood of his ranch. The discovery unsettled Maeve deeply. It made the threat of Silas Pryor feel real and immediate. A few days later, while organizing a small stack of papers in Cole's desk, deeds, receipts, livestock counts, her hand stilled on the official survey map of Hart's Draw. She remembered the conversation between Cole and Deputy Rowe. She traced the boundary line with her finger, her eyes scanning the neat, official script, and then she saw it. In the section describing the water rights for the lower pasture, a number had been altered. The original figure, a 7, had been clumsily scraped away and replaced with a 1, changing the legal access point by hundreds of feet. The ink was slightly different, the penmanship cruder. It was a small, almost insignificant detail, but it was a forgery. A deliberate act of theft on paper. Before she could decide how to tell Cole, a new crisis emerged, one that dwarfed the concerns of fences and finances. June, who had been a little listless all day, suddenly developed a fever. By evening, she was flushed and shivering, her breathing shallow and ragged. The change in Cole was terrifying to watch. As June's condition worsened, he seemed to retreat inward, the color draining from his face. The capable man who could face down a winter storm or a midnight prowler became paralyzed. He stood by her cot, his hands clenched at his sides, his face a mask of raw, helpless fear. Maeve recognized the look. It was the look of a man reliving a nightmare, "We need to get the fever down," Maeve said, her voice calm and practical. "Taking charge. Fetch me cold water and cloths." He moved as if in a trance, his actions mechanical. Maeve bathed June's forehead and wrists, murmuring soothing words. The little girl tossed and turned, her small body radiating a frightening heat. "It was a fever that took her, Mother," Cole said, his voice a hoarse whisper from the shadows across the room. "Started just like this. After the flood, the cold got into her lungs. I could not stop it." Maeve's heart went out to him. His grief was a raw, physical presence in the room. She knew he was seeing not just his sick daughter, but the ghost of his dead wife. "This is not the same. Cole," she said softly, using his first name without thinking. "June is strong. We will stay with her. We will not leave her." She sat by the cot all night, changing the cloths, coaxing small sips of water between June's lips. She did not sleep, sometime in the deep, silent hours before dawn. Cole came and stood beside her. The fire had burned down to embers, and the only light was the faint, cold glow of the stars through the window. "I am afraid," he said, the admission torn from him. "I am so afraid of losing her too. I do not think I could survive it." The simple, honest words broke through the last of Maeve's own reserve. She looked at this strong, silent man, his face etched with a pain so profound it was almost holy. "I know what it is to be afraid," she whispered, her own voice thick with unshed tears. "I was afraid when I stepped off that train. I was afraid of being alone, of having my name and my honor stained by a man's broken promise. Fear is a cold companion, Mr. Hart." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and for the first time she felt he was not seeing a stranger or a housekeeper, but an equal, a fellow soul who understood the landscape of loss. "You are not alone now, Maeve," he said quietly, and in the small, warm room, with the wind howling outside and a sick child breathing fitfully between them, they shared a moment of profound, unvarnished truth. The fear did not vanish, but for a little while, it was no longer a solitary burden. By morning, June's fever had broken. She woke up weak but clear-eyed, asking for a drink of water in her own small voice. The relief that washed through the small cabin was a palpable thing, as real as the sunlight slanting through the window. Cole's shoulders, which had been hunched with tension for 2 straight days, finally relaxed. He looked at Maeve over the top of June's sleeping head, and his eyes held a raw, unguarded gratitude that said more than any words could. The shared vigil through the long, dark night had forged a new kind of bond between them, an intimacy born not of romance, but of shared fear and mutual reliance. They were no longer just a rancher and his housekeeper. They were allies who had stood together against the dark. In the days that followed, a subtle shift occurred. The space between them seemed to shrink. Cole began to talk more, not in long conversations, but in small observations about the weather, the cattle, or a hawk circling overhead. He started leaving a cup of coffee for her in the mornings, and though it was still strong enough to dissolve a horseshoe, the gesture was a quiet admission of her place in his home. Maeve, in turn, felt a sense of belonging that was both comforting and deeply unsettling. She was building a life here, a temporary one, but the roots were sinking deeper with every passing day, tangling with the lives of this quiet man and his daughter. With June on the mend, Maeve turned her attention back to the ranch's ledgers. The altered water deed had lit a fire of suspicion in her, and she was determined to find any other sign of Silas Pryor's machinations. She had a neat, methodical mind, and she spent an afternoon going through the past year's worth of receipts and account books. It was in a tally for fencing supplies from the previous autumn that she found it. Cole had purchased a large quantity of steel wire from the mercantile in town. She remembered him mentioning that the fence he had just repaired had failed far too quickly. Cross-referencing the receipt with a bill of lading from the freight company, she noticed a discrepancy. The receipt from the mercantile, which was partly financed by Pryor's bank, listed high-grade American steel, But the freight order, from the railroad depot, specified a shipment of cheaper, lower-quality wire imported from overseas. Someone had charged Cole for the best but had given him inferior material, pocketing the difference. It was a classic swindler's trick, small enough to go unnoticed by a busy rancher, but profitable when repeated over and over. It was another tentacle of Pryor's influence, squeezing the life out of the small rancher's $1, one faulty fence post at a time. She showed her findings to Cole that evening. He studied the 2 documents, his expression hardening into granite. "I wondered why that wire snapped so easily in the first snow," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The man at the mercantile swore it was the best on the market." "The man at the mercantile is likely in Pryor's pocket," Maeve said softly. "It is a small cheat, but it proves a pattern." "It proves he is a thief," Cole corrected her, his hand clenching into a fist on the table. "And a liar." A few days later, they rode into town for supplies. Deputy Abel Rowe found them near the blacksmith's shop, his young face creased with worry. He tipped his hat to Maeve before turning to Cole. "Cole, I have been doing some quiet asking about your water rights, like I said I would." Abel began, keeping his voice down. "The clerk at the land office is a cousin of Pryor's wife, and I'm hearing things, pressure from the bank, threats of calling in loans. Pryor is making it very clear that anyone who sides with you might find themselves out in the cold come winter." He looked Cole squarely in the eye. "I am getting pressure, too. The sheriff told me to let it lie, that it is a civil matter, but I know a crooked deal when I see one. I just wanted you to know. I will not be pushed. I took an oath to uphold the law, not the interests of one powerful man, but we need more than suspicion. We need proof that cannot be denied." "We are working on it, Abel," Cole said, his voice grim. "Thank you." The deputy's words, meant to be reassuring, only heightened the sense of a closing net. Pryor's power was pervasive, his influence seeping into every corner of Sagebrush Crossing. The month of April arrived dry. The winter snows had been lighter than usual, and they melted quickly, leaving the high plains thirsty. The sun beat down with an unseasonable intensity, turning the new spring grasses from green to a pale, brittle yellow. A hot, dry wind blew constantly from the south, a restless breath that carried the scent of dust and distant smoke. The ranchers watched the sky, their faces etched with the same worry Cole's now wore. It was fire weather. The fire started on the North Ridge, a place where the grass grew thick and tall in a shallow basin. No one knew how it began. A stray spark from a passing train, a careless campfire, or a bolt of lightning from a dry storm. The cause did not matter. The result was a plume of gray smoke that stained the clear blue sky, a signal of disaster that every person on the plains knew and feared. Cole saw it first. He was on the porch, mending a bridle, when his head snapped up, his nostrils flaring like a horse sensing danger. "Fire," he said, the single word, sharp and cold. Maeve ran out of the house, June clinging to her skirts. She saw the smoke, a rising, angry column that was already being pushed toward them by the relentless wind. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her for a heartbeat. But then she looked at Cole's face. He was not panicked. He was focused, his jaw set, his mind already calculating, planning. "Maeve," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. "Get June inside. Close all the windows and doors. Fill every bucket, every pot, every basin you can find with water from the well. Soak as many blankets and grain sacks as you can. I am going to try and cut a fire break with the plow." She did not question him. She simply nodded, her own fear receding in the face of his steady command. She ushered a frightened June into the house, explaining that they had to play a game with water, making her feel like a helper. Then she worked with a frantic, focused energy, her arms aching as she hauled bucket after bucket from the well. The clang of the pump was a desperate heartbeat against the rising roar of the wind and the distant, ominous crackle of the flames. Cole hitched his strongest plow horses and drove them hard, carving a deep, wide furrow in the dry earth between the fire and his home. The black soil turned over, a desperate, dark line of defense. But the wind was fierce, and embers, like malevolent red insects, were already beginning to leap across the gap, starting small spot fires in the grass on the other side. He came back to the house, his face grim and streaked with dirt. "The brake will not hold," he said, his voice tight. "The wind is too strong. We have to beat it back." He grabbed several soaked grain sacks. Maeve, having secured June safely in the root cellar with a lantern and a promise to return soon, was right behind him. Grabbing more sacks for herself, they ran toward the fire line. The heat was a physical blow, a blast from an open furnace. The air was thick with smoke that burned the lungs and stung the eyes. The world was reduced to a roaring, chaotic nightmare of orange flames and swirling black ash. They worked side by side, a desperate two-person army against an overwhelming force. They beat at the creeping lines of fire with the wet sacks. The heavy thud. Thud. Thud, a frantic rhythm of survival. The smoke blinded them. The heat scorched their skin. But they did not stop. In the chaos, they moved as one. When Cole stumbled on the uneven ground, Maeve's hand was there to steady him. When a gust of wind drove the flames toward her, he stepped in front, taking the worst of the heat. They did not need to speak. A shout, a gesture, a shared glance was enough. They were a team. Their movements synchronized, their wills bound together by the single, desperate goal of saving this small patch of earth, this home. They fought until their arms felt like lead, until their lungs were raw, until the world was nothing but the searing heat and the suffocating smoke and the rhythmic, exhausting slam of wet burlap against burning grass. As the sun began to set, painting the smoke-filled sky in apocalyptic shades of purple and orange, the wind, as if exhausted by its own fury, finally began to die down. The main fire had burned past them, but the immediate threat to the house and barn was over. They had won. They stood in the blackened, smoking field, two small, solitary figures in a landscape of devastation. They were exhausted, filthy and sore, but they were standing. Cole leaned on the handle of a shovel, his head bowed, his chest heaving. Maeve stood a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself, shivering despite the lingering heat from the scorched ground. Ash fell around them like a soft, gray snow. "We did it," she whispered, her voice a hoarse rasp. He looked up at her. Her face was smudged with soot. Her hair had come loose from its pins and was wild around her face. But in the strange, twilight glow, he thought he had never seen anyone more beautiful. He saw the strength in her, the resilience that matched the unyielding landscape around them. He took a step toward her, then another. He reached out and gently brushed a streak of black soot from her cheek with his thumb. His touch was surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the rough, calloused skin of his hand. It was an act of simple, unconscious intimacy that short-circuited the air between them. Maeve looked up into his eyes. She saw the exhaustion, the relief, and something else, something deeper and more vulnerable than she had ever seen in him before. The walls he kept so carefully maintained had been burned away by the fire, leaving the man himself exposed. The roar of the flames was replaced by the frantic beating of her own heart. He lowered his head, his gaze locked on hers. She knew he was going to kiss her, and in that moment, she wanted him to. She wanted the comfort, the connection, the affirmation that they had survived, that they were alive. She leaned forward, her eyes fluttering closed. But just as their lips were about to meet, a wall of her own slammed down. A cold wave of reality washed over her. She was Maeve Collier, the woman with the valise, the woman in the borrowed home. She was not ready to be defined by another person, to be sheltered under another name. She had come west to build a life of her own choosing, not to stumble into one out of necessity and gratitude. She pulled back abruptly, turning her head away. "I cannot," she whispered, the words tasting of ash and regret. I am not ready to wear another's name. Not yet. The vulnerability in Cole's eyes vanished, replaced by the familiar, guarded mask. He dropped his hand and stepped back, the space between them once again a vast, uncrossable territory. The moment was broken, the connection severed. I was not offering one, he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He turned and walked back toward the house, his back straight and rigid. Maeve stood alone in the field of ash, a profound sense of loss settling over her. She had fought a fire and won, only to be defeated by the ghosts of her own past. Later that night, after June was asleep and the house had settled into a tense, wounded silence, Maeve found something tucked under the front door. It was a folded piece of cheap paper. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside, written in crude, blocky letters, were a few simple words. "Get out of Hart's Draw before the town fair, or you will be burned out for real." The crude, anonymous note felt like a sliver of ice against Maeve's skin. She had shown it to Cole, whose face had become a thundercloud. His jaw set so tight a muscle jumped. He had wanted to ride straight to the sheriff's office, to confront Pryor, to do something, but Maeve had stopped him. And say what she had asked, her voice steadier than she felt, that we received a note. Pryor will laugh and deny it. This is what he wants, to scare us, to make us run. Her chin lifted. I am not running. Her bravery was a thin cloak against the chill of fear, but it was all she had. The days leading up to the spring fair were thick with a tense, unspoken understanding. The easy camaraderie born of fighting the fire and nursing June was gone, replaced by a careful distance. The almost kiss hung in the air between them, a ghost of a possibility that now seemed a world away. They were polite, efficient partners in running the ranch, but the shared glances and accidental touches ceased. It was a lonelier silence than before. The day of the fair dawned bright and clear, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue that seemed to mock the darkness of the threat hanging over them. To stay away would be to admit defeat. To go was to walk into the lion's den. "We should go," Cole said at breakfast, his voice flat. "We need to show them we are not afraid." He looked at Maeve. "You do not have to. No one would blame you." "If you are going, then we are going," she replied, leaving no room for argument. June, oblivious to the undercurrents, clapped her hands in delight at the prospect of a town visit. Maeve took extra care with her appearance, choosing a simple but well-made calico dress, a deep blue that brought out the color of her eyes. It was an act of defiance. She would not look like a victim. She braided her hair neatly and pinned it up, a soldier preparing for battle. When she came out of her room, Cole was waiting, wearing a clean shirt and his best hat. He looked at her, and for a fleeting moment, the guarded expression in his eyes softened. He simply nodded, and they left. The fair was in full swing. The main street of Sagebrush Crossing was alive with people, ranchers and their families, miners from the hills, merchants and drifters, all mingled under the spring sun. The air was filled with the smells of roasting meat, popcorn, and horse manure, and the sounds of laughter, haggling, and the lively, scraping notes of a fiddle tuning up in the town hall. They moved through the crowd, a quiet, self-contained unit of three. Cole walked with a straight-backed vigilance, his eyes constantly scanning, while Maeve kept a firm hold on June's small hand. They were an object of intense curiosity. Conversations paused as they passed, and they felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on their backs. Inside the town hall, the atmosphere was even more charged. The room was hot and crowded, decorated with paper streamers and lit by dozens of oil lamps. A long table was laden with cakes, pies, and jugs of cider for the fundraising auction. On a raised platform at one end, a trio of musicians sawed away at a lively tune. This was the social heart of the territory, and tonight, Maeve felt like she was the main attraction. She was standing with Maggie O'Rourke, discussing the plans for the children's reading circle. When the first man approached, he was a horse trader from out of town, a large man with a booming voice and a diamond stick pin in his cravat. He made a florid bow and asked for the honor of the first waltz. Before Maeve could politely decline, a second man stepped up, a merchant from the mercantile, holding a small, gaudily wrapped box of chocolates. Then a third, the town blacksmith, his face scrubbed clean, but his hands still bearing the permanent grime of the forge. Within minutes, it became clear this was no random sequence of invitations. It was a performance. A line began to form. A deliberate, almost comical procession of suitors. There was a young, swaggering ranch hand who promised her a pony, an old, wealthy cattleman who spoke of his vast herds, and a grim-faced man with a pistol strapped to his hip who simply stared at her with cold, possessive eyes. Some were clearly goaded on by their friends. Others seemed to have been encouraged by a shared purpose. She could feel the hand of Silas Pryor behind this, turning her into a spectacle, a prize to be won, a woman whose reputation was up for public auction. The crowd watched, murmuring and nudging one another. It was a cruel, brilliant piece of social theater, designed to humiliate her and to isolate Cole. She felt a hot flush of shame and anger. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She stood frozen, a butterfly pinned to a board. Cole was across the room, near the back wall. He stood alone, his hands pushed deep into his pockets, his hat pulled low. He was watching her, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He made no move to intervene, no offer of rescue. He was leaving the choice entirely to her, honoring her fierce independence even as it was being publicly shredded. It was a painful, terrible kind of respect. The line grew. 8 men, 9, 10, a dozen gentlemen, or so they called themselves. They stood there, a wall of expectation, each man representing a different kind of future she did not want, a future of wealth without warmth, of status without substance, of a name without a home. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to run, to disappear, just as the blacksmith at the front of the line stepped forward to press his claim. She felt a small tug on her hand. She looked down. June was standing beside her, her small face serious, her dark eyes filled with a child's simple, unwavering clarity. She had seen the line of men, and she had seen her father standing alone in the shadows. She leaned in close to Maeve, her small hand squeezing hers for emphasis. A dozen gentlemen lined up. June whispered, her voice a clear, pure note in the noisy hall. She skipped them all and took the cowboy's hand for life. The words struck Maeve with the force of a physical blow. They were not just a child's fantasy, they were the truth, her truth. In that instant, all the fear, all the humiliation, all the doubt fell away. She knew what she had to do. She let go of June's hand and took a step forward. The blacksmith beamed, thinking she was coming to him. The entire hall seemed to hold its collective breath, but Maeve did not stop. With her head held high, she walked past him. She walked past the merchant with his chocolates, past the horse trader with his diamond pin, past the hired gun with his cold eyes. She walked the entire length of the ridiculous, hopeful, and insulting line, her gaze fixed on the quiet, solitary figure at the back of the room. A wave of astonished murmurs rippled through the crowd. She did not hear them. She only heard the beating of her own heart. She stopped directly in front of Cole. He had not moved, but she saw the surprise, the question in his eyes. Without a word, she held out her hand. He looked down at her offered hand, then back up at her face. For a long, silent moment, the world seemed to stop. Then, slowly, he pulled his own hand from his pocket and took hers. His palm was warm and calloused, a map of hard work and quiet strength. It felt like coming home. As their fingers laced together, a great, collective sigh, and then a smattering of applause went through the hall. Maeve turned, and with her hand held firmly in Cole's, She let him lead her to the center of the dance floor. The musician, sensing the shift in the room, struck up a slow, sweet waltz. They began to move, two solitary figures in the center of a circle of onlookers. They were not graceful dancers. Cole was stiff, his movements unpracticed. Maeve was more accustomed to the precise work of a needle than the sweeping steps of a waltz. They were clumsy. They stumbled once or twice, but they moved together. They found a rhythm that was all their own, a quiet, steady turning that shut out the rest of the world. Cole held her securely, his hand a warm, solid presence on the small of her back. She rested her other hand on his shoulder, feeling the strength there. She looked up at his face, and the mask was gone. In his eyes, she saw a dawning wonder, a fragile hope that he had long since buried. "I choose peace, not polish," she whispered, her voice for his ears alone. A slow smile, a real one, spread across his face, transforming his harsh features into something gentle and achingly handsome. "Peace is a fine thing to choose," he murmured back. They finished the dance in a comfortable silence, the unspoken things between them finally settling into a quiet kind of understanding. As the last note of the fiddle faded, the applause was louder, more genuine. For the first time since she had arrived in Wyoming, Maeve felt the warmth of acceptance from the community. They had seen not a scandal, but a choice. They were about to walk off the floor when a voice, smooth and cold as riverstone, cut through the applause. "A touching display, truly." The crowd parted. Silas Pryor stood there, a self-satisfied, proprietary smile on his face. He was dressed in an expensive suit, his silver hair perfectly combed. He commanded the room without raising his voice. "It seems congratulations are in order for our town's most determined new arrival," Pryor continued, his eyes glittering with malice. "In fact, it feels like a celebration, and every celebration needs a guest of honor. I have taken the liberty of inviting an old acquaintance of yours, Miss Collier, someone who has traveled a very long way to see you." Pryor stepped aside, gesturing toward the main entrance. A man stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the night. He was tall and slender, dressed in the fine, dark clothes of an Eastern gentleman. As he stepped forward into the lamplight, a wave of cold dread washed over Maeve, so intense it made her knees weak. His face was handsome, familiar, and shadowed with a history she had prayed she had left behind forever. The kind eyes from the letters were not kind at all. They were calculating and weak. "Maeve, my dear," the man said, his voice a parody of the affection he had once professed on paper. "I have finally found you." It was Jasper Quinn. The name, Jasper Quinn, fell into the stunned silence of the town hall like a stone into a deep well. Maeve's hand went cold in Cole's grasp. The air, which moments before had been filled with warmth and the sweet music of the waltz, was suddenly thin and hard to breathe. This was not a ghost from her past. This was the architect of her ruin, standing before her in flesh and blood. Cole's grip on her hand tightened, a silent, protective anchor in the swirling vortex of her shock. He stepped slightly forward, placing himself between Maeve and the newcomer. His body was a solid, unmoving shield. Jasper's smile did not reach his eyes. It was a polished, practiced thing, a salesman's smile. "I have been searching for you everywhere." "Maeve," he said, his voice carrying through the hall. "There was a terrible misunderstanding, a delay. I arrived at the station only a day after you. Imagine my despair when I found you had vanished." He was weaving a story for the crowd, painting himself as the frantic, devoted fiancé. Maeve could see the performance for what it was, a carefully constructed lie. Silas Pryor stood to one side, watching the scene unfold with the satisfaction of a playwright seeing his drama come to life. "The misunderstanding," Maeve said, her voice shaking only slightly, "was my belief that you were a man of your word." A gasp rippled through the onlookers. This was better than a dance. It was a confrontation. Now, Pryor interjected, his voice smooth as oil. This is clearly a private matter, best discussed in a more private setting. Mr. Quinn is my guest. Perhaps you and Mr. Hart would join us in my office at the bank to clear the air. It was not a request. It was a command disguised as one. Cole's instinct was to refuse, to pull Maeve away from this venomous charade and take her home. But he looked at her face and saw not just fear, but a flicker of a fighter's resolve. She would not run from this. She could not. He gave a single, curt nod. The walk to the bank was a public spectacle. The crowd parted for them, their whispers following like rustling leaves. Inside Pryor's opulent office, with its dark wood desk and leather chairs, the pretense of civility was dropped. The door closed, shutting out the town, and the trap was sprung. "Let us dispense with the pleasantries," Pryor said, seating himself behind his desk like a king on a throne. "Mr. Quinn has brought a fascinating piece of information to my attention. Miss Collier, it concerns a small, seemingly worthless piece of property." He slid a map across the desk. It was a survey of the land along the Sweetwater River. His finger tapped a specific parcel, a narrow strip of rocky shoreline right at a bend in the river. "This piece of land," Pryor said, "was willed to you by a great-aunt you barely knew. The deed, I believe, is in your possession. A minor inheritance you likely thought nothing of." Maeve's mind raced. She remembered a bundle of old papers tucked into a side pocket of her valise, given to her by a lawyer after her aunt's passing. She had been so focused on her impending marriage, her escape from Virginia, that she had barely glanced at them. "That land is worthless," Cole said, his voice a low growl. "It is rock and scrub." "To a rancher, perhaps," Pryor said with a smug smile. "But to a man with vision, a man who intends to build a permanent dam to control the valley's water, that specific location is the single most valuable piece of real estate in this territory. The bedrock there is perfect. It is the key to everything." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Jasper's arrival, the public humiliation, this meeting. It was all a coordinated attack. "I came here to make things right." "Maeve," Jasper said, stepping forward. He tried to inject a note of sincerity into his voice. "I was foolish. I made a mistake, but I can offer you a new start. Sign the land over to Mr. Pryor's company, and I will be given a handsome fee, enough for us to go anywhere, to build a fine life together." The audacity of it stole her breath. He had abandoned her, left her stranded and shamed, and now he was offering to sell her future back to her with the proceeds from her own inheritance. "You will get nothing from me, Jasper," she said, her voice trembling with a cold fury. "Not a signature, not another word." Jasper's charming facade crumbled, revealing the ugly desperation beneath. "You foolish girl," he hissed. "Did you think you could just start over? Did you think your past would not follow you?" He turned to Cole, his eyes glittering with malice. "You should ask your new housekeeper about her final days in Virginia. Ask her about the man she nearly killed. A simple disagreement in a dress shop, I believe. But she has a temper. She left him bleeding in an alley. The law called it assault. Her family's money made it go away. But the story remains." The words hit Cole like a physical blow. He looked at Maeve, a question in his eyes. A wound. He had just taken her hand, had just chosen her in front of the entire town. And now this, a secret life, a violent past she had never mentioned. Maeve felt the blood drain from her face. Jasper was twisting the truth into a weapon. "He was a ruffian," she said, her voice a desperate whisper. "He cornered me. He was tearing the dress I had made. He tried to hurt me. I had shears in my hand from my work. I defended myself. It was self-defense." "A convenient story," Pryor said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "The point is, a scandal is a messy thing. A woman with a violent past, living with a widower. Tongues will wag, but it can all be forgotten. A simple signature is all it would take." It was an impossible choice. Her honor or her home, her past or her future. "Get out," Cole said, his voice dangerously quiet. He took Maeve's arm. "We are leaving." They walked out of the bank and back into the charged atmosphere of the fair. But everything had changed. The story, poisoned by Jasper and Pryor, was already spreading, moving through the crowd faster than a prairie fire. The curious glances were now hard with judgment. The whispers were filled with accusation. Maeve felt as if her skin had been peeled away, leaving every nerve exposed. The ride back to the ranch was a torment of silence. The trust that had been so tentatively built between them lay shattered. When they arrived, Maeve could not bear the look of wounded confusion on Cole's face. The shame was a physical weight, suffocating her. This house was no longer a sanctuary. Her presence here had brought danger and scandal to his door. "I am sorry, Cole," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to bring this on you." Before he could respond, she turned and fled. She ran from the house, from the questions in his eyes, from the life she had just begun to build. She ran without thought, without direction, her only instinct to escape the crushing weight of her own past. Cole stood on the porch and watched her go. He felt a cold, familiar emptiness return, the hollowness of loss he knew all too well. He had let his guard down for one night, and this was the price. He drove the wagon back to town in a fury of confusion and betrayal. He found himself outside Hattie's eatery. She was there, closing up for the night. She took one look at his face and knew. "So you let her run?" Hattie said. It was not a question. "She lied to me. Hattie—" "Did she?" Hattie shot back, her hands on her hips. Or did she have a piece of her past she was not ready to share with a man who keeps his own heart locked away in a tin box? That girl stood up to a fire. She nursed your child. And tonight, she walked past a dozen better offers and took the hand of a stubborn, silent cowboy. What more proof of her character do you need? It is not that simple. "It is exactly that simple. You fool," Hattie said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "You love her. I see it. The whole town sees it. The only one who cannot see it is you, because you are too terrified of feeling anything again. Now, are you going to stand there feeling sorry for yourself? Or are you going to go find the best thing that has happened to you since the good Lord gave you that little girl?" Meanwhile, Deputy Abel Rowe had not been enjoying the fair. He had been watching a man on the edge of the crowd, a man who walked with a distinct, uneven limp. He had seen the man talking to one of Pryor's known associates. On a hunch, Rowe slipped away from the festivities and followed the man at a distance as he left town, heading east along the river. The trail led him to a rough camp set up near the construction site for Pryor's new dam. From the cover of the brush, Rowe watched as the limping man produced a custom rivet with a star-shaped head, identical to the one Cole had found by his water pump. The man handed it to another, who then used it to repair a piece of heavy equipment. Abel had his proof. As darkness fell, the sky, which had been so clear all day, began to change. Ominous. Purple-black clouds boiled up on the horizon, moving with an unnatural speed. A low rumble of thunder echoed across the plains. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and ozone. At Heart's Draw, June was asleep in her cot, her wooden bird held tight in her hand. The water bell on the porch was silent. Upriver, at Pryor's construction site, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall on the shoddily built temporary dam. A slapdash structure of earth and raw timber designed to hold back the sweet water just long enough for his scheme to work. The rumble of thunder grew louder, closer. A jagged fork of lightning split the sky, illuminating the churning, rising river. The rain turned into a torrential downpour, a solid wall of water. The pressure against the weak dam increased. A timber groaned, then snapped. The earthen wall, improperly packed, began to dissolve with a sound like a cannon shot. A section of the dam gave way. A towering, churning wave of brown water, carrying logs and debris, was unleashed into the night. A monstrous, unstoppable torrent roaring down the narrow channel of the draw. directly toward the small, silent ranch house where a little girl slept alone. The water bell began to clang, a frantic, desperate alarm against the fury of the storm. The first sound was the frantic, desperate clanging of the water bell. It was a sound Maeve had come to associate with a quiet, ever-present grief. But now it was a raw, shrieking alarm that sliced through the howl of the storm. She had been running through the lashing rain, away from the ranch, away from Cole, away from the shame that clung to her like wet clothes. But the sound of that bell stopped her cold. It was not a ghost ringing that bell. It was the river, and June was in that house. Shame was a luxury. Fear was a privilege. All that was left was a single, primal instinct to protect the child. She turned, her flight from the past becoming a desperate race toward the future, and ran back into the teeth of the gale. The rain had turned to hail, small, stinging stones of ice that battered her face and shoulders. But she did not feel them. She only felt the frantic pounding of her own heart, a drumbeat against the thunderous roar of the rising water. Hattie's words had struck Cole with the force of a physical blow. "You love her." He had stood frozen on the eatery's porch, the truth of it an unwelcome revelation. As he turned to get into his wagon, he heard it too, a change in the pitch of the storm, a deep, grinding roar that was not thunder. It was the sound of the world coming apart, then, faint but clear, carried on the wind, came the panicked ringing of the bell. June. He did not think, he acted. He lashed the horses and the wagon lurched into the muddy street, careening through the storm-lashed darkness on a reckless, prayer-fueled journey back to the draw. They reached the edge of the property at nearly the same moment, two souls driven by the same terror. The sight that met them was a nightmare. The placid creek had become a monstrous, churning beast. A brown, debris-choked river was boiling out of the draw, and the small ranch house, their sanctuary, was an island in a raging sea. The water was already climbing the porch steps, clawing at the foundation. Cole leaped from the still-moving wagon, splashing into the knee-deep, frigid water. Maeve was right beside him. There was no time for words, for apologies or accusations. Their eyes met for a single, stark second in the brilliant, fleeting glare of a lightning strike. And in that moment, there was only one truth: June was inside. They fought their way to the door, the current pulling at their legs, trying to drag them down. They burst into the main room. It was pitch black, and the water was already a swirling, icy lake around their ankles. The furniture was beginning to float, bumping into their legs like lost animals in the dark. June Cole's voice was a raw shout of pure terror. A frightened sob came from the corner. "Papa?" He plunged through the darkness toward the sound. Maeve, her mind racing, spotted the heavy coil of rope that always hung by the door. She tore it from its peg just as Cole emerged from the shadows, June clinging to his neck, her small body trembling violently. They had to get out. They had to get to the barn, which sat on a small rise. Their only hope of high ground. They staggered back out into the maelstrom. The water was higher now, a powerful, sucking force at their waists. As they turned toward the barn, figures materialized out of the sheeting rain, blocking their path. A flash of lightning illuminated their faces. It was Jasper Quinn, his fine Eastern clothes soaked and ruined, his face a mask of desperation. Beside him stood the hulking, limping man from the pump house. "The deed!" Maeve Jaspers screamed over the roar of the river. He held up a small, oilskin pouch. "I have a pen, an indelible pencil. Sign it, sign the land over, and we will help you get the girl to safety." It was the devil's bargain, offered at the end of the world, his final, pathetic attempt to profit from her pain. Maeve looked at him, at the man who had promised her a life and had delivered only ruin, who was now trying to barter a child's life for a piece of dirt. The fear she had felt for her reputation, for her past, was burned away by a clean, white-hot rage. She held the lantern she had snatched from inside, its flickering flame a small point of defiance in the overwhelming dark. You abandoned me to the wind once. Jasper, she shouted, her voice ringing with a strength she did not know she possessed. I will not abandon this child to the water. The limping man took a menacing step forward, but before he could move further, a gunshot cracked through the night, impossibly loud even over the storm. A spray of water erupted at the man's feet. That is far enough, a voice bellowed. Deputy Abel Rowe emerged from the darkness, his pistol steady in his hand. Your game is over. Quinn, I have a witness who saw this man. He nodded toward the henchman. At Pryor's Dam tonight. In the chaos of that moment, another flash of lightning lit the scene upstream. It revealed a third figure, Silas Pryor himself, wrestling with the wheel of a secondary sluice gate. He was trying to open it wider, to guarantee the flood would scour Hart's Draw from the face of the earth. But as he put his shoulder to the wheel, the sodden earth beneath him gave way. The entire structure of the main dam, weakened beyond endurance, collapsed with a deafening roar. A solid wall of water, a wave twice as high as before, erupted from the breach, thundering directly toward Pryor. He screamed, a thin, reedy sound that was swallowed by the deluge. He was going to be swept away, annihilated. Cole did not hesitate. It was not a choice, it was an instinct, the core of his being. He shoved June into Maeve's arms. Hold her, he yelled. He grabbed the end of the rope from Maeve's hand, took 2 running steps, and hurled himself into the torrent, casting the rope with all his strength. It landed just within Pryor's reach. Cole dug his heels into the slick mud, his muscles straining, and pulled his sworn enemy from the very jaws of the destruction Pryor himself had unleashed. He dragged the sputtering, terrified banker to the relative safety of a large boulder that was still above the waterline. Then he turned back to his family. The barn, he shouted. Now! With Abel covering them. Cole took the rope and fought his way through the raging water to the barn, securing the end to a thick support post. The rope stretched from the house to the barn, a single fragile lifeline over the roaring flood. They had to cross. Abel went first, moving quickly to secure the prisoners. Then it was their turn. Cole went into the water, positioning himself in the middle, a human anchor to help guide them. Come on! Maeve, he yelled. Hold tight to the rope, I have got you. Clutching a whimpering June to her chest with one arm, Maeve gripped the rope with the other and stepped into the torrent. The force was immense, a living thing that wanted to tear her from her feet. The water was a churning, icy chaos of mud and debris. A heavy log slammed into the rope, and she heard a sickening, tearing sound. The rope snapped. The world dropped out from under her. She and June were swept away, tumbling into the deadly current. The lantern was extinguished. The darkness was absolute. June screamed. In that heart-stopping, infinite second, Cole reacted. He abandoned the rope, abandoned his own safety, and lunged through the black water in the direction of the scream. His hand shot out, grasping blindly in the chaos. His fingers closed around a wrist, Maeve's wrist. He held on, his grip an iron band of pure will. The current tore at them, trying to rip them apart, but he would not let go. He wrapped his other arm around her, pulling her and the child tight against him, his boots finding a desperate purchase on the rocky bottom. He held on as if the fire, the drought, the loneliness, and the grief had all been a prelude to this one singular moment. He held on as if in his entire life there was only one thing he could be sure of, this hand, and this home. Somehow, he fought his way back to the barn, dragging them with him. They collapsed into the hay of the loft, a tangle of cold, trembling, exhausted limbs. They were alive. They were together. As the long night wore on, the storm finally broke. The thunder receded, and the torrential rain softened to a steady drizzle, then stopped. Huddled in the hay, wrapped in dry horse blankets, they watched as the terrible river began to recede, its power spent. The first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a pale, rosy light over a world remade. The draw was a wasteland of glistening mud, uprooted trees, and shattered debris. The ranch house still stood, but it was battered, wounded. As the light grew stronger, they saw figures approaching, riders from town, Hattie and Maggie among them, their faces etched with worry. They had come to see what the storm had wrought. What they found was a scene of startling clarity. They saw Deputy Rowe, his face grim, leading a handcuffed Silas Pryor, who was covered in mud and stripped of all his dignity. They saw another deputy leading a sniveling Jasper Quinn, who had slipped and fallen in the muck while trying to flee. And they saw Cole Hart, his arm wrapped securely around Maeve Collier, with the small, sleeping form of his daughter held safely between them, standing in the doorway of the barn, watching the sun rise. The flood had washed away more than just the land. It had washed away the lies, the whispers, and the suspicion. In the clear, clean light of the new day, the community of Sagebrush Crossing finally saw the truth. The justice that came to Sagebrush Crossing was as swift and clear as the sky after the storm. There was no grand courthouse, no black-robed judge from Cheyenne. Justice was delivered in the muddy main street, under the watchful eyes of the entire community. Deputy Abel Rowe, his face streaked with grime but his back straight with conviction, laid out the facts. He presented the custom-made rivet found at Cole's pump house. He had the testimony of the freight agent who had unwittingly delivered low-grade wire to the mercantile. He had the sworn statement of a man who had seen Jasper Quinn and Pryor's hired man, the one with the limp, conspiring on the night of the fire. And then, one by one, the townspeople spoke. A rancher whose loan had been threatened by Pryor, a woman who had seen Jasper Quinn arrive in town not a day late, but a full week before the fair, meeting secretly with the banker, Hattie Bell, her voice ringing with indignation, recounted Pryor's public machinations at the dance. The weight of their combined testimony was an avalanche that buried Silas Pryor's lifetime of carefully constructed power. He stood there, soaked and shivering in his fine suit, no longer a titan of commerce, but just a small, greedy man exposed in the morning light, Jasper Quinn. His face a pathetic mask of collapsed arrogance, could only stammer denials that no one believed. The circuit judge was not due for another month, but Abel Rowe, empowered by the unified will of the community, declared Pryor and his associates under arrest, to be held for the federal authorities on charges of fraud, endangerment, and attempted extortion. He publicly reinstated the original survey lines for Hart's Draw, declaring the altered deed a forgery. The crowd let out a ragged cheer, a sound of profound relief. The shadow that had loomed over the valley for so long had finally been broken. In the aftermath, something else broke as well. The wall of suspicion that had surrounded Maeve as she stood beside Cole, watching the deputies lead the prisoners away. People began to approach her, not with stares, but with quiet words. An older rancher's wife, a woman who had looked through her just days before, took her hand. "We are sorry, child," she said, her eyes filled with a sincere shame. "We judged you unfairly. You have more grit and goodness than any of us knew." One by one, they came. Maggie O'Rourke hugged her fiercely. Hattie Bell clapped her on the shoulder, her gruff way of showing deep affection. They were apologies not just for their judgment of her, but for their own fear, for allowing a man like Pryor to hold such sway over their lives for so long. Maeve accepted their words with a quiet grace, the knot of shame she had carried since her arrival in Wyoming finally, blessedly, dissolving. She was no longer the unclaimed bride or the widower's housekeeper. She was one of them. The flood had taken much, but it had also given something back. It had washed the land clean, and now it was time to rebuild. A few days later, a small army of wagons and riders descended on Hart's Draw, led by Hattie and Maggie. The people of Sagebrush Crossing had come to help. The men worked to shore up the damaged riverbank, their shovels moving in a steady rhythm, their voices joined in work songs and good-natured insults. The women arrived with baskets of food and pots of coffee, a much-improved brew from Cole's, and set up a makeshift camp, turning a disaster into a community gathering. While the adults worked, Maggie gathered the children on the newly cleaned porch of the ranch house, with a collection of primers and a piece of charcoal. She held the first session of her reading circle, the sound of young voices stumbling through the alphabet. A sound of hopeful, determined learning became the new music of the ranch. Maeve watched them, a lump forming in her throat. This was the life she had dreamed of, not one given to her by a man's promise, but one she had earned through fire and flood, one she had built with her own 2 hands alongside people she had come to care for. That afternoon, when the work was done and the last of the wagons had rumbled away, a profound peace settled over the draw. The Sweetwater River, once a raging monster, now flowed gently within its newly reinforced banks, its surface sparkling in the late afternoon sun. Cole asked Maeve to walk with him down to the water's edge. June tagged along, her small hand holding one of Maeve's fingers, chattering happily about the new words she had learned. They stood on the bank, the air cool and clean, smelling of damp earth and new beginnings. Cole was quiet for a long time, his gaze on the flowing water. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. "The river took my wife," he said, the words simple, heavy with the weight of memory. "I thought it had taken my heart, too. I spent the last year building walls against it, against everything. I was afraid that if I let anyone else in, the water would just rise again." He turned to look at Maeve, his eyes clear and direct. "You did not let the walls stop you. You walked right through them. You faced the fire, and you faced the flood. You faced down your own past. You showed me that a home is not just something you protect. It is something you build, every day." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple ring of worn gold. It was not shiny or new. It was burnished with the love and labor of a lifetime. "This was my mother's," he said. "I cannot promise to forget what I have lost. The scars on this land and on my heart will always be there. But I can promise to learn how to love what is right here, in the present. I can promise to spend the rest of my days learning how to be a husband worthy of the woman who stood her ground when the whole world was trying to wash her away." He held out the ring. "Maeve Collier, will you make this house your home and take my name as your own?" Tears welled in Maeve's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or shame. They were tears of a joy so profound it felt like sunlight spreading through her soul. Before she could answer, June, with the solemn wisdom of a child, stepped forward. She opened her small fist. In her palm lay a small strip of blue ribbon she had taken from Maeve's sewing basket. She gently pushed the ribbon into Maeve's free hand. "This is for you," she said seriously, "so your name can belong to our house." Maeve laughed through her tears, a sound of pure, unadulterated happiness. She looked at the earnest little girl, and at the steady, hopeful man, and she knew she had already found her home. She held out her left hand. "Yes, Cole," she whispered. "Yes, I will." He slid the worn gold band onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. That evening, they danced on the porch. There was no fiddle, no crowd, only the quiet murmur of the river and the first stars pricking the deep purple of the twilight sky. They were still clumsy, their steps a little unsure, but they moved together, 2 halves of a whole. Maeve rested her head against his shoulder, the rough wool of his shirt familiar and comforting. "This waltz is just as clumsy as your coffee," she teased, her voice soft. Cole held her a little tighter, a low chuckle rumbling in his chest. "Clumsy is all right," he said, "as long as your hand stays in mine." And so it did. The whole town had seen a dozen men line up for the woman who arrived in a worn wedding dress. But in the end, she had skipped them all, choosing instead the quiet strength of the cowboy's hands, the ones that knew how to hold on, how to rebuild, how to keep a home and a heart, safe through the storm. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night. Like the video. And press the support button so more people can hear this story.